She was humiliated and forced out of her seat, but just minutes later, the same flight attendant who had embarrassed her was now facing consequences no one could have predicted. What happened on this flight wouldn't just change the lives of those on board, it would shake the entire airline to its core. Welcome to Soul Deep Stories. If you enjoy thought-provoking stories with meaningful life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to hear the full story. And now let's begin. Amelia Reed stepped onto the airplane with a quiet confidence that caught the attention of a few passengers. She wore a well-fitted blazer over a sleek yet simple dress, her natural curls framing her face elegantly. In one hand she carried a leather laptop bag, in the other her first-class boarding pass. She walked down the aisle with steady composure, her eyes glancing at the seat numbers as she passed. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the assured presence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Upon reaching her assigned first-class seat, she offered a polite smile to the passenger beside her before carefully placing her bag in the overhead compartment and settling in. She glanced out the window, taking in the vast sky as she waited for takeoff, the clouds stretching endlessly before her. Reaching into her bag, Amelia pulled out a small notebook and pen, jotting down a few notes, fully immersed in her work. She barely noticed the occasional curious glances directed her way. Just minutes later, Olivia Hayes, one of the flight attendants, strode briskly through the first-class cabin. Her crisp uniform was flawless, her blonde hair and fair skin accentuating her poised, elegant demeanor. Her sharp gaze moved across the passengers, almost as if she were assessing them. And then, her eyes landed on Amelia. She hesitated. Something about the woman caught her attention, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. A flicker of tension crossed Olivia's face as she approached, stopping beside Amelia's seat. "Excuse me," Olivia said, her tone polite but tinged with authority. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Amelia looked up, slightly surprised but unfazed. She smiled gently and handed over her ticket. "Of course." Olivia took the ticket, scanning the details. A small crease formed between her brows. "This is a first-class ticket?" she asked, skepticism creeping into her voice. Amelia nodded, her tone calm and unwavering. "Yes, I booked this seat myself, 2 weeks ago." A brief silence followed. Olivia seemed to wrestle with something in her mind before finally handing the ticket back without another word. She turned away, her lips pressing into a tight line. But the tension on her face said everything. This wasn't over. And this was only the beginning of the storm about to unfold. As Olivia walked away, her rigid posture betrayed a lingering doubt. A suspicion that something about this situation wasn't quite right. And she wasn't going to let it go. Meanwhile, Amelia simply shrugged off the exchange, refocusing on her notes. Her pen glided smoothly across the page, her expression calm as if nothing had happened. She was so engrossed in her writing that she didn't notice Olivia standing near the galley, whispering to another flight attendant, occasionally casting sharp glances in her direction. Even from a distance, the tension on Olivia's face was unmistakable. It didn't take long before Olivia returned, this time with a different energy, her posture more rigid, her expression more authoritative. "Miss Reed, could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify some information." Amelia blinked, momentarily surprised but remained composed. She carefully placed her pen inside her notebook, closed it neatly, then stood, retrieving her leather laptop bag before following Olivia toward the galley. In the first-class cabin, passengers exchanged confused glances, their whispers growing louder as they watched the situation unfold. Yet Amelia's demeanor remained poised, unshaken, as she stood in the narrow space near the galley, waiting for Olivia to speak. "I'm going to have to ask you to change seats," Olivia stated, crossing her arms. "It seems there may have been a mistake with your booking." Amelia tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing. "A mistake? I don't think so. I booked this ticket 2 weeks ago and it was confirmed. Perhaps you should check again? I still have my receipt and payment history right here." With that, Amelia quickly unlocked her phone, pulling up the confirmation and receipt from 2 weeks prior. She handed it to Olivia, her expression calm and confident. Olivia's tone hardened, her gaze cold. "I've already checked. I don't believe this seat is appropriate for you. You'll need to move to the main cabin." For the first time, Amelia's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second. A trace of disbelief. A flicker of irritation. But just as quickly she regained her composure. "I don't understand," she said evenly. "My ticket is valid. Why should I have to move?" Olivia's shoulders tensed, her voice dropping to a sharp, icy whisper. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move or I'll have to call security to assist." A moment of silence hung between them. Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly, but she simply gave a small nod and turned back toward her seat. She gathered her belongings, each movement precise, unhurried. By now the entire cabin was watching. The whispers had turned into a quiet wave of speculation. As Amelia walked toward the back of the plane, Olivia following closely behind, she could feel the weight of every stare. Still she kept her head high, her steps steady, but her grip on her laptop bag tightened ever so slightly. When they reached the main cabin, Olivia gestured toward an empty seat in the middle row. Without a word, Amelia placed her bag under the seat and sat down. Amelia sat down in her newly assigned cramped seat, her expression unreadable. Olivia turned on her heel and walked away, her posture rigid, as if satisfied with how she had handled the situation. Left alone, Amelia turned toward the window, gazing out at the vast sky beyond. Outwardly she appeared calm, but beneath the surface her thoughts raced, oscillating between frustration and disbelief. Without hesitation she reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen, typing a precise and deliberate message. The moment she hit send, the corner of her lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, subtle, knowing, and filled with intent. The hum of the airplane engines droned in the background, but the tension in the cabin was unmistakable. A few passengers cast hesitant, sympathetic glances in Amelia's direction, while others chose to avert their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge the uncomfortable reality unfolding before them. Amelia, however, paid them no mind. She remained focused, her eyes scanning her phone screen as she navigated through her contacts. Without hesitation, she placed a quick call, keeping her voice low but unwavering. "Hello, it's me," she began smoothly. "I need a favor. Something happened and I'd like it handled immediately." She listened for a moment, nodding slightly as the response came through. "Yes, I'm still on the plane. No need to escalate just yet, just be ready. Watch for my signal." With that, she ended the call as swiftly as she had started it, sliding the phone back into her bag. Though Amelia remained outwardly composed, there was an unmistakable shift in the air. Her calmness wasn't one of resignation, it was the quiet confidence of someone who had already set things in motion. Back in first class, Olivia carried on with her duties, moving through the cabin with a sense of self-satisfaction. She flashed polite smiles, checked on passengers, and ensured that drinks were served promptly. Yet, no matter how much she tried to focus on her routine, her thoughts kept drifting back to Amelia. There was something unsettling about the way Amelia had responded to the situation. She hadn't argued, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't caused a scene. Instead, she had remained unerringly poised, completely in control of herself. That composure gnawed at Olivia, though she couldn't quite understand why. From where Olivia stood, she had handled everything appropriately. The matter should have been settled. And yet, a nagging feeling at the back of her mind refused to fade. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, another flight attendant, a younger woman named Claire, moved gracefully through the aisle. Unlike Olivia, Claire exuded warmth and attentiveness. When her eyes fell upon Amelia, she hesitated for a moment before approaching. Carrying a small cup of water, she crouched slightly to Amelia's level, her voice soft and filled with genuine concern. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Claire asked gently, her eyes searching Amelia's face for any sign of distress. Amelia looked up, her composed expression softening just slightly. A warm yet reserved smile touched her lips. "I'm fine, thank you," she said evenly. "Just a bit of a mix-up, I suppose." Claire lingered for a moment, clearly sensing that there was more to the story. But something about Amelia's poised demeanor made her hesitate to ask further. "If you need anything, just let me know," Claire offered before placing the cup of water on Amelia's tray and stepping away. Amelia nodded in quiet appreciation, lifting the cup and taking a slow sip. As she set it back down, her fingers lightly tapped against the rim, her mind still working, still anticipating what was to come. Claire gave Amelia a small, reassuring smile before stepping away, disappearing into the steady rhythm of cabin service. Amelia nodded slightly, lifting the cup of water to her lips, but her mind was elsewhere. Meanwhile, Olivia carried on in first class, oblivious to the ripple effect her actions had set into motion. To her, the situation had been handled. The passenger had been moved, the disruption had been silenced, and the flight was proceeding smoothly. She felt a quiet satisfaction as she handed out drinks, exchanging pleasantries with first-class travelers who had already forgotten the minor incident. But Amelia hadn't forgotten. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as she gazed out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a serene contrast to the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. Amelia wasn't the kind of person to let something like this pass without consequence. But she wasn't reckless either. She valued precision over chaos, calculated action over emotional outbursts. And she had already put everything into motion. 7 minutes passed before a crackling voice broke through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We hope you're enjoying your flight. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let one of our crew members know." Amelia's eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, her expression unreadable. The announcement was routine, but to her, it was merely background noise to something far more significant unfolding behind the scenes. She pulled out her notebook, flipping it open with deliberate care. After jotting down a single, precise line, she snapped it shut. Whatever was coming next, she was more than prepared for it. Around her, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Passengers were absorbed in their books, movies, or quiet conversations, the earlier tension seemingly forgotten. But Amelia remained perfectly still, her presence exuding a silent intensity. In first class, Olivia moved efficiently through her duties. She barely spared a thought for Amelia, feeling certain that any discomfort caused had been left in the past. As far as she was concerned, the matter was closed. But the past was far from forgotten. Amelia leaned slightly forward in her seat and unlocked her phone once more. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a brief moment before typing a short, cryptic message. "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done." She hit send. The faint glow of the screen illuminated her face, highlighting the unwavering composure in her expression. No one around her noticed. The passengers were either too distracted or too indifferent to see the quiet power shifting in real time. Amelia's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Not smug. Not vengeful. Just knowing. Had Olivia seen it, she might have felt a flicker of unease. But she hadn't. Not yet. At the front of the first-class cabin, Olivia stepped into the galley and exchanged a few words with a fellow flight attendant, Daniel. A seasoned crew member, Daniel had been with the airline for years and often served as a mentor to younger staff. Leaning slightly toward him, Olivia lowered her voice. "Did you see that woman earlier?" She cast a subtle glance toward the economy cabin, where Amelia was now seated. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The one I moved to economy," Olivia clarified, her tone laced with implication. "She had a first-class ticket, but something about her just didn't sit right with me." Daniel crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "Didn't sit right? What do you mean?" Olivia hesitated, realizing she needed to choose her words carefully. "I had a gut feeling, better safe than sorry, right?" Daniel's frown deepened, his gaze sharpening. "A gut feeling isn't a reason to bump a passenger when their ticket is completely valid. Did she do anything wrong?" Olivia pressed her lips together. "No, but..." Daniel cut her off, his tone firm. "Then you'd better hope this doesn't come back to bite you. First-class passengers don't take kindly to being moved, and neither does the airline." Olivia opened her mouth to argue, but before she could respond, the in-flight phone in the galley buzzed. Daniel reached for it, his expression neutral as he listened. A moment later, his brow furrowed, and he glanced at Olivia with a mix of curiosity and concern. "It's for you," he said, handing her the phone. "They're asking for you by name." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated before taking the receiver, suddenly aware of the cold sweat forming on her palms. "This is Olivia," she said cautiously. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline's executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding an incident involving a first-class passenger. Upon landing, you'll need to provide a full report on the matter. In the meantime, ensure that all passengers are treated respectfully and refrain from altering seat assignments without proper justification." Olivia felt her stomach drop as the weight of those words settled over her. "Why, yes, of course," she stammered. "I'll make sure everything is handled appropriately." But Olivia didn't answer right away. She simply clenched the phone tighter in her grip, her gaze unconsciously shifting toward the economy cabin, where Amelia Reed still sat as calm and composed as ever. Daniel observed Olivia closely, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked again, his tone calm but probing. Nothing, Olivia muttered, but the nervous edge in her voice betrayed her. She risked a glance toward the main cabin where Amelia sat, still and composed. But now that composure took on an entirely new meaning. For the first time Olivia felt a flicker of unease. Amelia, with her notebook now closed and resting on her lap, appeared completely oblivious to the phone call that had just taken place. She wasn't watching Olivia. She wasn't causing a scene. And yet, as Olivia turned to resume her duties, she caught the faintest movement, the subtle curve of Amelia's lips into the smallest, most knowing smile. The realization settled over Olivia like a cold weight. She hadn't put an end to the situation. She had only just set things in motion. Shaking off the feeling, Olivia moved through the aisle, forcing herself to focus on her tasks. She smiled at passengers, checked on drinks, ensured everything appeared normal. But despite her efforts, the phone call still echoed in her mind like an unshakable shadow. Her hands moved with practiced precision, but her thoughts kept drifting, to Amelia, to the growing uncertainty in her chest. Meanwhile, Amelia remained seated, calm as ever. Occasionally, she glanced at her watch, crossing her legs with ease before picking up the in-flight magazine and flipping through its pages absent-mindedly. To any onlooker, she looked completely at peace, as if nothing about her day had been disrupted. But inside, she knew everything was unfolding exactly as she had planned. A few moments later, Claire reappeared beside her, her warm presence once again standing in stark contrast to Olivia's earlier hostility. "Excuse me, ma'am," Claire said softly. "Would you like something to drink? Maybe a snack?" Amelia looked up, her polite smile effortless. "Just water, please." Claire nodded and disappeared for only a moment before returning with a cup of water and a neatly folded napkin. She placed them gently on Amelia's tray table. "If there's anything else you need, just let me know," Claire added kindly. Amelia's gaze flicked to Claire's name tag before meeting her eyes. "Thank you, Claire," she said, her voice warm and genuinely appreciative. Claire returned a small but sincere smile before stepping away, leaving Amelia to her thoughts once more. From a distance, Olivia watched the entire exchange unfold, and the unease inside her only deepened. There was something about Amelia, about the way she carried herself, about the way she interacted so effortlessly with Claire, that didn't match the narrative Olivia had built in her mind. And that bothered her more than she was willing to admit. She felt an uneasy pull in her gut, the same feeling one gets when they realize, far too late, that they've made a mistake. Olivia felt an inexplicable urge to regain control of the situation, but she knew she had to tread carefully now. The call from the executive office had made that abundantly clear. This was no longer just a minor incident. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the steady hum of the engines provided an almost deceptive sense of normalcy. Yet, beneath the surface, tension simmered. Needing a moment to collect herself, Olivia made her way back to the galley, where Daniel was busy preparing the next round of refreshments. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, glancing up at her. Olivia hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a nod. "Yeah. Fine," she said curtly, reaching for a stack of cups. Daniel wasn't convinced. He set down the tray in his hands and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, whatever's going on, you'd better hope you didn't mess with the wrong passenger," he murmured. "First class isn't for amateurs, Olivia. These people have connections." Olivia stiffened at his words but didn't respond. Instead, she focused on methodically stacking the cups, though her hands weren't as steady as before. Daniel's warning struck a nerve. Who was Amelia Reed really? And why was Olivia starting to feel like she had severely misjudged her? At that very moment in the main cabin, Amelia's phone buzzed quietly in her lap. She glanced down, her expression unreadable as she read the short message. "All set. They're monitoring." Without a word, she slipped the phone back into her bag and reached for her cup of water, taking a slow sip. Every movement was deliberate, calm, and unhurried, like someone who had all the time in the world. The growing tension between Amelia and Olivia hadn't gone unnoticed. A few observant passengers had picked up on the shift in energy. A man seated across the aisle from Amelia leaned over slightly and spoke in a hushed voice. "That flight attendant has been giving you a hard time, hasn't she?" Amelia turned to him, her expression composed, revealing nothing. "It's nothing I can't handle," she replied smoothly, her voice steady and quiet. The man raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to the story than she was letting on. But he didn't press further. He simply nodded and leaned back in his seat. Amelia turned her gaze back to the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds. To anyone else she looked completely at ease. But beneath the surface she felt a quiet satisfaction. The gears were turning. And Olivia had no idea just how far-reaching the consequences of her actions would be. Back in the first-class section, Olivia's unease deepened with every passing minute. The weight of the earlier phone call pressed heavily on her, making the cabin feel smaller, the air around her heavier. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something she wouldn't be able to control. Olivia's unease grew with each passing minute. Though the plane remained steady, the atmosphere in the cabin felt increasingly heavy. Every task, checking seat belts, distributing drinks, felt mechanical, her usual confidence replaced by nervous, fleeting glances toward the main cabin. No matter how much she tried to distract herself, her mind kept circling back to Amelia. Every time Olivia stole a glance in Amelia's direction, she was met with the same image, poised, composed, and entirely at ease. There was something about the way Amelia carried herself that unnerved Olivia. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was quiet authority. A presence that seemed unshaken by anything Olivia had done. Meanwhile, Amelia remained undisturbed. She continued gazing out of the window, occasionally jotting something down in her notebook. To the casual observer, her actions appeared mundane. But for those paying closer attention, there was an unmistakable sense of purpose behind every movement. Passengers seated nearby couldn't help but take notice. The contrast between Amelia's unbothered demeanor and Olivia's growing discomfort was stark. Whispers began circulating throughout the cabin, though no one dared to openly acknowledge the tension unfolding in real time. Then came the moment Olivia had been dreading. Daniel approached her in the galley, his face unreadable. Without a word, he handed her a neatly folded note. "The captain wants to see you," he said quietly. Olivia's stomach dropped. "What? Why?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. Daniel shrugged, though there was a faint edge of disapproval in his gaze. "He didn't say. Just go." Reluctantly, Olivia turned and made her way toward the cockpit. Each step felt heavier than the last. As she entered, the door shut behind her, sealing her away from the rest of the cabin. Captain Harris, a middle-aged man with a calm yet authoritative presence, turned to face her. His co-pilot barely spared her a glance before refocusing on the controls. "Olivia," Captain Harris began, his voice measured. "We've received another call from the executive office." Olivia's heart sank. "Sir, she started, but the captain raised a hand, cutting her off. "This is serious," he continued. "The passenger you moved, Miss Amelia Reed, is not just any passenger. She has direct ties to the airline's board of directors. We have been given explicit instructions to ensure she is treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of this flight." Olivia's mouth went dry. "I didn't know," she stammered. "I thought." "Did you think?" Captain Harris interrupted, his tone growing firmer. "Or did you assume?" For the first time, Olivia felt the full weight of what she had done. And she was beginning to realize, this wasn't just a mistake. It was a disaster. "To the board," Olivia finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's hands paused over the snack cart as he turned to face her fully. His expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, concern or perhaps quiet disappointment. "You're serious?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Olivia swallowed hard and nodded. "The captain just told me. We're under strict orders to ensure she's treated with the utmost respect for the rest of the flight." Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Olivia, do you have any idea what this means?" Olivia clenched her jaw. "I didn't know," she muttered. "But you assumed," Daniel countered, echoing the captain's words from earlier. His voice wasn't accusatory, but the weight of his statement hung heavy between them. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned away, pretending to busy herself with adjusting the tray of drinks. But her hands weren't as steady as before. In the main cabin, Amelia remained undisturbed. Every movement she made was deliberate, precise, measured. As Olivia moved through the aisle, trying to regain some sense of control, she felt Amelia's gaze lift briefly. Their eyes met for just a second. No malice, no confrontation. Just that same unsettling calmness, as if Amelia already knew exactly how this would end. A sudden, invisible weight pressed down on Olivia's chest. She quickly averted her gaze, picking up her pace as she retreated to the galley once more. For the first time in her career, she felt completely out of control. And she hated it. But worse than that was the growing, gnawing certainty deep in her gut. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Daniel straightened, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something closer to alarm. "The board?" he repeated, his voice lower now. "Are you serious?" Olivia gave a stiff nod, her face pale. The captain just told me. Daniel exhaled sharply. Olivia, this is bad. Really bad. I had no idea, Olivia muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I thought. She stopped mid-sentence, realizing the weight of her words. Daniel crossed his arms, his gaze sharp. She didn't seem like what? Olivia hesitated. Like someone who belongs in first class? Daniel finished for her, his voice edged with quiet disappointment. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she turned away, pretending to busy herself with the inventory, but her hands fumbled slightly. Daniel shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and disappointment flickering across his face. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Amelia glanced at her watch again. The flight was nearing its halfway point, yet she remained as composed as ever. Reaching into her bag, she retrieved her phone and typed a short message. Almost time. Sliding the phone back into her bag, she leaned back, her demeanor unshaken. The quiet but undeniable shift in the cabin's atmosphere had not gone unnoticed. Passengers nearby were growing increasingly curious, their hushed conversations punctuated by stolen glances in Amelia's direction. The man across the aisle, the same one who had spoken to her earlier, leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you sure you're okay? That flight attendant looked pretty rattled earlier. Amelia turned to him, offering a faint but reassuring smile. I appreciate your concern, she said, her voice polite yet firm. But everything is under control. The man studied her for a moment before nodding. Though he still seemed skeptical, there was no denying the quiet confidence in Amelia's words. It left him wondering, was there more to her than met the eye? At the front of the plane, Olivia was struggling to regain her composure. She moved stiffly through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers, her usual professional smile now feeling brittle and forced. But no matter how hard she tried to push it aside, her mind kept racing. The fact that Amelia had connections to the airline's board was bad enough. But what unsettled Olivia even more was the way Amelia had handled the entire situation. She had never raised her voice, never lost her temper. That kind of restraint was rare and powerful. As Olivia returned to the galley to prepare for the next round of service, a chime echoed through the cabin, signaling an incoming announcement. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for choosing to fly with us today. Our flight is progressing smoothly, and we're on schedule for an on-time arrival. Please continue to enjoy your flight, and as always, don't hesitate to let our crew know if you need anything. The announcement was routine, meant to reassure passengers. But to Olivia, every word felt like a weight pressing down on her, a subtle reminder of just how badly she had miscalculated. Almost involuntarily, her eyes flicked toward the main cabin, seeking out Amelia. To Olivia's surprise, Amelia was already looking at her. For a brief moment, their gazes met. Then, with quiet confidence, Amelia gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't smug. It wasn't confrontational. It was simply acknowledgement. A chill ran down Olivia's spine. Whatever Amelia Reed was planning, Olivia was beginning to understand one thing. She was completely unprepared for it. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, but it did little to mask the invisible tension that now stretched between them. Olivia tried to focus on her duties, forcing herself to move methodically through the motions. But nothing felt natural anymore. Every action was mechanical, every step weighed down by the unease that clouded her mind. She deliberately avoided looking toward the main cabin, yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling of Amelia's presence. Like an unspoken force, quietly setting things into motion just beyond her sight. Meanwhile, Amelia remained composed, a portrait of calm control. She glanced at her watch, then at the small screen in front of her, noting the flight's progress. A faint smile touched her lips, but it disappeared just as quickly as it had come. With deliberate precision, she leaned forward, retrieved her notebook and began to write again. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, every word carefully chosen. To a casual observer, it was nothing more than a mundane moment. But for Amelia, every detail mattered. Back in the galley, Olivia's discomfort only deepened. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed tightly as she tried to quiet the rising anxiety within her. Daniel, who had been watching her closely for most of the flight, finally spoke. You've been tense ever since that phone call, he said, his voice low but firm. What's really going on? Olivia hesitated, her eyes darting toward the curtain separating the galley from the main cabin. I told you already, she muttered, her voice tight. The passenger I moved, she has connections. Important ones. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Important enough for the captain to get involved? That's not just connections, Olivia. That's a warning, Daniel said, his tone serious. What exactly did you do to her? I didn't do anything. Olivia snapped, but the defensive edge in her voice betrayed her growing anxiety. Daniel didn't look convinced. She didn't belong in first class and Olivia stopped herself, but it was too late. Daniel's eyes narrowed. You assumed she didn't belong, he said, his voice sharp. And now you're paying for it. He shook his head. I've been with this airline for years. If you cross someone with real power, you'd better brace yourself. People like that don't just let things slide. Olivia clenched her jaw, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. What was I supposed to do? She muttered. Daniel didn't hesitate. She didn't seem like what? He pressed. Like someone rich enough to sit in first class? His tone was cutting now. Like someone who could afford to fly up there with the rest of them? Olivia fell silent. Her fingers curled around the edge of the counter, knuckles turning white. Daniel sighed heavily and shook his head. You should have left her alone. Now you've made a mess way bigger than you realize. With that, he turned back to his duties, leaving Olivia standing there, a wave of panic washing over her. She knew he was right. But it was too late. She glanced toward the main cabin again, her heart pounding. Amelia was still seated, as composed as ever. Her notebook was now closed, tucked neatly away. The faint smile she had worn earlier was gone, replaced with something even more unnerving, an expression of quiet resolve. Just then a chime echoed through the cabin. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse quickened as she reached for the galley phone, her hands trembling slightly. Galley, this is Olivia, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. This is the captain, came the calm yet authoritative tone. We've received another communication from the executive office. They've requested that Miss Reed be given full priority service for the remainder of the flight. Ensure she's comfortable, personally apologize for any earlier inconvenience. Olivia's stomach twisted. Why yes, sir, she managed to say before the line went dead. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a direct order. One she couldn't ignore. Summoning what little composure she had left, Olivia inhaled sharply and prepared herself for what came next. Olivia steadied herself, forcing her feet to move forward. This time she knew, without a doubt, that the power dynamic had shifted completely. Whatever happened next was no longer in her control. Stepping out of the galley, Olivia clutched a glass of sparkling water on a tray, her fingers gripping it tighter than necessary. Her usual poise had vanished, replaced with visible tension. Each step toward the main cabin felt heavier, the weight of her earlier decisions pressing down like an anchor. She wasn't just delivering water. This was something unspoken, an acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. As she reached Amelia's seat, she hesitated. The tray trembled slightly in her grip. Amelia looked up, her expression calm, unreadable. The air between them thickened, charged with something Olivia couldn't quite define. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Miss Reed, Olivia began, her voice softer than anyone on the flight had heard before. I wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced earlier. It was a misunderstanding on my part. Amelia tilted her head slightly, her sharp but composed gaze locked onto Olivia. A misunderstanding, she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. Olivia's forced smile wavered. Yes, I didn't mean to disrupt your experience. Please accept this as a token of apology. She placed the glass of sparkling water on Amelia's tray table, her hand unsteady. Amelia regarded the glass for a moment, then looked back at Olivia. Thank you, she said simply, her tone neutral. But I think it's going to take more than a drink to fix this. The words, though spoken softly, hit Olivia like a slap. She swallowed hard, feeling the first beads of sweat forming on her palms. Of course, Olivia stammered. If there's anything else I can do to make this right, please let me know. Amelia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, studying Olivia with a quiet intensity, as if carefully weighing her next move. The silence stretched just long enough to make Olivia fidget uncomfortably. Finally, Amelia offered a faint smile, not smug, not triumphant. Just calm. Confident. I appreciate your effort, Amelia said at last. But I believe the airline will address this matter appropriately. And with that, the conversation was over. After we land. Olivia's stomach sank. The mention of the airline was a clear signal. Amelia wasn't letting this incident go. I understand, Olivia murmured, lowering her gaze. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked back toward the galley as quickly as she could without breaking into a full retreat. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, her mind racing with the implications of Amelia's words. This wasn't over. Not even close. Whatever was coming next was completely beyond her control. Meanwhile, Amelia picked up the glass of sparkling water and took a small sip. She set it back down with careful precision, her expression giving nothing away. To the passengers around her, she appeared as calm and composed as ever. But inside she knew. The game had shifted entirely in her favor. Back in the galley, Olivia barely made it to the counter before slumping against it, her face pale. Daniel, who had been watching the exchange from afar, raised an eyebrow. "How did it go?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Olivia shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's not done," she said. "She's going to take this all the way." Daniel sighed, his expression grim. "I told you," he muttered. "People like her? They don't play games. You should have known better." Olivia didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the curtain separating the galley from the main cabin, her mind spinning. For the first time she truly understood. Amelia Reed wasn't just another passenger. She was someone who wielded far more power than Olivia had ever imagined. And now, Olivia was paying the price for underestimating her. She remained in the galley, trapped in her own thoughts, replaying every moment of the flight in her head. She had never felt so small. So exposed. Daniel moved quietly around her, occasionally throwing her a concerned glance but saying nothing. It was clear that he understood the gravity of the situation. And it was just as clear that Olivia was completely out of her depth. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Amelia closed her notebook and placed it back in her bag with deliberate care. Adjusting her posture, she sat tall and composed as if preparing for something. Around her, the faint hum of whispered conversations reached her ears. But she paid them no mind. Because she already knew. The real conversation hadn't even started yet. Amelia remained composed, her focus unwavering. Every movement she made was precise, intentional. Not long after, the intercom chimed again, this time carrying a distinct air of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your trays are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." A flurry of activity followed as passengers adjusted their seats and secured their belongings. Claire, the attentive flight attendant from earlier, made her way back to Amelia's row. She offered a warm smile, though a flicker of unease lingered in her eyes. "Is there anything I can get you before we land, Miss Reed?" Amelia shook her head politely. "Thank you, Claire. You've been very kind." Claire's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask," she replied before stepping away to continue her duties. Amelia's calm tone had reassured her, but the tension in the cabin was impossible to ignore. At the front of the plane, Olivia busied herself with the final pre-landing checks. Her movements were stiff, mechanical, every action fueled by nervous energy. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was a storm of anxiety. The captain's directive and Amelia's quiet but pointed words replayed in her head like a haunting refrain. She could feel the eyes of Daniel and the other flight attendants on her. No one said anything. No one had to. As the plane descended through the clouds, Amelia glanced out the window, watching as the sprawling cityscape of their destination came into view. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest, her demeanor as poised as ever. Despite the chaos brewing within Olivia, Amelia felt entirely in control. Every step of the journey had unfolded exactly as she had anticipated. And she was ready for what came next. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the runway with practiced precision. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, followed by the familiar rustling of passengers unbuckling seat belts and retrieving their belongings from the overhead compartments. The usual chatter filled the air, but beneath it, an undercurrent of tension lingered. Especially for Olivia. She was acutely aware of Amelia's presence. And even more aware of the looming consequences waiting for her beyond the aircraft doors. The weight of what was coming next settled heavily in Olivia's chest. As the seatbelt sign switched off, Amelia remained seated, unrushed. With quiet precision, she reached into her bag and retrieved her phone, typing a brief message. "We've landed. Be ready." Sliding the phone back into her bag, she directed her gaze toward the front of the plane. Olivia was standing near the exit. For the briefest moment their eyes met. Olivia's stomach twisted. The cabin doors opened, allowing the cool air of the jet bridge to filter in. Passengers began disembarking in an orderly fashion, the murmurs of casual conversation blending with the clatter of luggage handles. Olivia stood stiffly, forcing a polite smile at each departing passenger. But her heart pounded as she waited for Amelia to approach. Yet Amelia didn't rush. She remained seated, waiting until the aisle had nearly emptied before standing. Gathering her belongings with the same effortless composure she had maintained throughout the flight, she moved toward the exit with measured steps. The remaining crew, including Claire and Daniel, exchanged knowing glances. Everyone could sense that something significant was about to unfold. As Amelia reached the exit, Olivia straightened, forcing herself to meet her gaze. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Reed," Olivia said, her voice wavering slightly. Amelia paused. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes were sharp, unwavering. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied smoothly. There was no malice in her tone. But the weight behind her words sent a chill down Olivia's spine. Without another word, Amelia stepped off the plane. Olivia stood frozen, staring after her, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Daniel approached cautiously. "You okay?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Olivia didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the open jet bridge door, as if expecting something. Or someone. And she wasn't wrong. Moments later, 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Passengers who were still gathering their belongings fell silent. The remaining crew instinctively stepped aside. The officers scanned the cabin before zeroing in on Olivia. "Are you Olivia Hayes?" one of them asked, his voice firm. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "Why, yes," she managed, barely above a whisper. "We need you to come with us," the officer stated. "We have some questions regarding an incident on this flight." The color drained from Olivia's face. This was it. The moment she had feared from the second she had made her choice. The color drained from Olivia's face as the weight of her actions finally came crashing down on her. Daniel watched in silence as the officers escorted her off the plane. Her usually composed posture was now rigid with barely concealed panic. The remaining crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what would happen next. Outside in the terminal, Amelia stood near the gate, her phone in hand. She observed calmly as Olivia was led away, her expression unreadable. The message she had sent earlier had done its job. And now the wheels were fully in motion. Without hesitation, Amelia turned and walked toward the baggage claim, her steps steady and purposeful. There was no need to look back. Everything was already exactly where she wanted it to be. The airport terminal buzzed with energy. Passengers hurrying to their destinations, families reuniting, travelers lost in their own worlds. In stark contrast, Olivia moved through it in a daze, flanked by security officers. The same passengers who had shared the flight with her threw curious glances her way. Some whispered. Others simply watched in silence. But no one approached Amelia. She continued forward, undisturbed, her every movement deliberate, as if she was already 2 steps ahead of everyone else. At the security holding area, Olivia sat in a small, stark room. A single table. 2 chairs. The officers who had escorted her off the plane stood near the door, their expressions professional but firm. The weight of the moment settled over her like a suffocating fog. Just hours ago, she had been a respected flight attendant. Now she was the subject of an investigation. And it had happened in the blink of an eye. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a calculated response. One of the officers finally spoke, breaking the suffocating silence. "Miss Hayes, we've been informed of an incident involving a first-class passenger on your flight. The airline's executive team has requested a full account of your actions." Olivia swallowed hard, her throat dry. I don't know what this is about," she stammered. "I was just doing my job." The officer raised an eyebrow. "According to the reports we've received, the passenger you removed from first class was Amelia Reed. Are you aware?" Olivia's heart sank further. I didn't know at first," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only found out during the flight." The officer leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Miss Reed is not only a high-ranking executive affiliated with this airline but also a major shareholder," he stated. "Her complaint has already reached the board, and they take allegations of bias and mistreatment very seriously." Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The officer's tone grew firmer. Miss Reed's account of the events has been documented, and additional passengers have corroborated her version of the story, he continued. We're giving you the opportunity to provide your side, but let me be clear, this matter will not be taken lightly. Olivia's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to explain. But even before the words could form, she knew, deep down, there was no justification that would hold up under scrutiny. She had made a snap judgment. And now, that judgment had cost her more than she ever could have imagined. Meanwhile at baggage claim, Amelia stood near the carousel, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried a note of finality. Yes, the security team has taken her in for questioning, she said. Make sure the board reviews the footage and statements. I want the matter resolved professionally, but thoroughly. She listened for a moment, nodding slightly as the person on the other end responded. Thank you. And please send a copy of the final report to my office. I want to ensure that this never happens again, not to me and not to anyone else. As she ended the call, the first of the luggage began to emerge on the conveyor belt. Without hesitation, she reached for her sleek black suitcase, pulling it off effortlessly. Around her, a few passengers from the flight watched with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. She didn't acknowledge them. Her focus remained entirely on her next steps. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, but Amelia moved through it with quiet determination. She had taken an incident of prejudice and turned it into a lesson no one would forget. Amelia had transformed humiliation into an opportunity for accountability and systemic change. And she wasn't done yet. Her quiet strength and strategic thinking had set the stage for a reckoning, one that Olivia and the airline would not soon forget. Back in the interrogation room, Olivia sat motionless, the sterile walls of the room closing in around her. Her breathing was shallow, the weight of the situation pressing down with an unbearable intensity. The officers gave her a moment to collect herself, but the silence only made it worse, suffocating, inescapable. Every second that passed made it harder to steady her nerves. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for this to happen, Olivia began, her eyes darting between the officers. I was just following protocol. I thought she didn't belong in first class. The officer closest to her leaned forward, his expression unreadable. And what exactly made you think that? Olivia's lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. She hesitated. Because deep down she knew the truth. Her assumption had been based on unconscious bias. And saying that out loud was something she couldn't bring herself to do. I don't know, she stammered. She didn't act like the other passengers in first class. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. Not acting like the other passengers isn't a justification for removing someone from their seat, especially when their ticket was valid. His voice was even, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Did she break any rules? Did she violate any airline policies? Olivia swallowed hard, her palms damp with sweat. No, but... The officer cut her off. Then you acted without cause. He let the statement sink in before continuing. Miss Reed was within her rights to remain in the seat she paid for. And your actions have put the airline in a very difficult position. Olivia's heart sank as the gravity of his words settled over her. She wanted to argue. She wanted to defend herself. But the facts were undeniable. Her decision had been based on nothing more than an assumption. And now she was facing the consequences. Outside the terminal, Amelia stepped onto the curb, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. A sleek black sedan pulled up smoothly in front of her. The driver, dressed in a sharp suit, stepped out and opened the door with practiced precision. Miss Reed, he greeted her with a respectful nod. Everything has been arranged as per your instructions. Amelia gave a small, approving nod. Thank you, William. Without another glance back, she stepped into the car, leaving behind an airline that would never forget her name. Amelia replied smoothly, sliding into the back seat with her usual grace. Once inside, she retrieved her phone and began scrolling through her emails. A new notification from the airline's board caught her attention. She opened it immediately. The email was concise but clear. It outlined the steps the board would take to address the incident, including a formal review of the airline's training policies and an assurance that Olivia's actions would not go unchecked. Amelia's lips curled into a faint smile of satisfaction. This was never about revenge. It was about accountability, about change, and it seemed she was already making progress. Back at the airport, the officers had finished their questioning. They stood, preparing to leave the room, but not before delivering one final, cutting statement. "This matter will be escalated to the airline's disciplinary committee," one of them said firmly. "You'll receive notification of their decision soon. In the meantime, you are suspended from duty." Olivia felt her stomach drop. She could only nod numbly as they exited the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. For the first time, the full weight of what had happened settled over her. She had completely underestimated Amelia Reed, and now she was paying the price. Outside, Amelia's car pulled smoothly away from the terminal. Blending seamlessly into the flow of evening traffic, she gazed out the window, her mind calm and clear. The day had been exhausting, but she felt an undeniable sense of satisfaction. She had stood her ground, and in doing so she had set a precedent. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. Another message from the airline's board. A full review of the incident was officially underway. Sensitivity training for staff would be implemented immediately. Amelia read the message carefully before typing a response. "Good. Let's ensure this never happens again." As the city skyline came into view, she leaned back in her seat, letting out a quiet breath. This chapter was closing, but the impact of her actions would remain, not just for the airline, but for everyone who worked there. Back in the small interrogation room, Olivia sat motionless. The officers were gone, but she hadn't moved. Her gaze was fixed blankly on the table in front of her, and for the first time in her career, she had no idea what would come next. The weight of her suspension, the looming investigation, and the sharp realization of what she had caused pressed down on Olivia like a crushing force. She replayed every decision she had made that day, each moment unraveling her confidence further. What had once felt like instinct, something she had convinced herself was justified, now felt like an irreversible mistake. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, already knowing that whatever awaited her on the screen wouldn't be good. It was a message from the airline's Human Resources Department. Formal. "Olivia, please be prepared to attend a disciplinary hearing scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Further details will be provided by email." Her hand trembled as she read the message. The finality of her actions became painfully clear. This wasn't just a review. This was the airline protecting itself. And Olivia knew she was being positioned as the scapegoat. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to argue that she had only done what she thought was right. But deep down she knew there was nothing she could say to undo the damage. Meanwhile, across the city, Amelia's car arrived at her office, a sleek, modern building in the heart of downtown. The driver stepped out and opened the door for her. She exited gracefully, adjusting the strap of her bag as she strode toward the entrance. Inside, her assistant, Maya, was already waiting for her. A warm smile, a stack of documents in hand. "It's all here," Maya said, handing her a folder. The board's initial review of the incident, statements from the crew, and the planned changes to training programs. They've moved quickly. Amelia took the folder and flipped through the documents, her expression thoughtful. "They know this can't be swept under the rug," she said calmly. "They're protecting their interests, but it's a step in the right direction." Maya hesitated before speaking, her voice careful. "Do you think she'll fight back? The flight attendant, I mean." Amelia paused, considering the question. "Maybe," she admitted, closing the folder. "But this isn't about her anymore." Her gaze lifted, steady and unwavering. "This is about the system that allowed someone like her to feel comfortable making decisions based on prejudice." She exhaled, her voice quiet but resolute. "That's what needs to change." Maya nodded, admiration clear in her eyes. "You've already made an impact." Maya's words lingered in the air, but Amelia didn't respond. She simply gave a small, knowing smile. The board was taking this seriously because of her. But she knew, this was just the beginning. Real change, systemic change, required persistence, patience, and Amelia had both. Back at the airport, Olivia finally forced herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady as she stepped out of the holding room, her body weighed down by exhaustion and the crushing reality of what had just happened. She avoided eye contact with the officers, with the airport staff, with anyone who might recognize her. The walk to the employee exit felt like a slow, humiliating descent, each step heavy with regret. Her uniform, once a symbol of her dedication, now felt like nothing more than a reminder of what she had lost. By the time she reached her car, her hands were trembling. Sliding into the driver's seat, Olivia gripped the steering wheel and stared ahead, her mind racing. She had spent years building her reputation as a capable, dedicated flight attendant. And now it was all unraveling. She thought about Amelia. Composed. Untouchable. The realization struck Olivia like a physical blow. Amelia had never lost control of the situation. She had been in charge from the moment Olivia made her first mistake. For the first time, Olivia allowed herself to feel something other than anger. Other than frustration. A deep, gnawing regret settled in her chest. She had underestimated Amelia Reed, not just as a passenger, but as a person. And now she was paying the price. As Olivia pulled out of the parking lot, the weight of everything she had lost pressed down on her like never before. Across the city, Amelia sat in her office, reviewing the documents Maya had given her. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the airline CEO. "I'd like to meet with you personally to discuss the incident and the next steps." Amelia typed a brief reply. "I'll make time tomorrow. Let's ensure this is resolved properly." Setting her phone down, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Her mind was already shifting toward the future. The day had been long, draining. But it had also opened a door. An opportunity to reshape the culture of an entire organization. And for Amelia, that was a fight worth having. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds of Amelia's office, casting long shadows across her desk. She sat, reviewing documents, drafting statements, preparing for her meeting with the airline CEO. Because for Amelia, this was never just about her own experience. It was about setting a precedent. One that no one could ignore. Should face the kind of treatment she had endured. At exactly 10 a.m., Maya escorted the CEO, Richard Hale, into the room. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a polished demeanor. Despite his confident exterior, there was a noticeable tension in his movements as he extended his hand to Amelia. "Miss Reed, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice," Richard began, his tone carefully measured. Amelia shook his hand, her expression calm but firm. "I appreciate you taking this situation seriously, Mr. Hale. Please have a seat." Richard sat across from her, adjusting his tie before speaking. "First, let me express my deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. It was completely unacceptable, and we are committed to ensuring that such incidents do not occur again." Amelia nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "However, apologies alone won't fix the underlying issues. This isn't just about one flight attendant making a poor decision. It's about the environment that allowed her to feel justified in that decision." Richard's face tightened slightly, but he nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right," he admitted. "That's why we've already begun a full review of our policies and training programs. We're implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all staff, and we'll be revisiting our internal reporting processes to ensure better accountability." Amelia leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "It's a start," she said. "But it's not enough. I want a detailed timeline for these changes, as well as regular updates on their progress. And I expect to see measurable results." Richard hesitated briefly before nodding. "Of course. We'll provide you with everything you need." A small, satisfied smile crossed Amelia's lips. "Good. Let's make sure this becomes a turning point for your organization, not just a one-time correction." The meeting continued for another hour. Amelia laid out her expectations. Richard took careful notes. By the time they finished, there was a clear sense of purpose in the room. As Richard stood to leave, he extended his hand again. But this time there was something different in his expression. Not just professionalism, but respect. There was genuine respect in Richard's gaze. "Thank you for holding us accountable," he said. "We'll make this right." Amelia shook his hand firmly. "I'll hold you to that." As Richard exited the room, Maya stepped in, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How did it go?" she asked. Amelia exhaled, her voice carrying both relief and determination. "It went well," she said. "But this is just the beginning. Meanwhile, across the city, Olivia sat in a sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing to begin. The weight of her suspension hung over her like a dark cloud, suffocating and inescapable. The silence in the room only amplified her growing anxiety. In front of her sat a neatly stacked file, page after page detailing her actions during the flight. Statements, complaints, and at the center of it all, Amelia Reed. The door swung open. A panel of 3 senior airline executives entered, their expressions neutral but firm. The woman in the center, with sharp features and an unmistakable air of authority, was the first to speak. "Miss Hayes, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss the incident that occurred on Flight 287 and the allegations made against you." Olivia nodded weakly, her throat dry. "I understand," she whispered. The executives wasted no time. They began reviewing the timeline of events, pressing Olivia to provide her account of what had happened. She tried to explain herself, tried to justify her actions. But every word felt hollow. "I thought she might have been in the wrong seat," Olivia said at one point, her voice faltering. "I was just trying to follow protocol." The sharp-featured executive raised an eyebrow. "Protocol?" she repeated. She flipped through the report before glancing back at Olivia. "According to our records, Miss Reed presented a valid first-class ticket. At what point did you verify this before asking her to move?" A cold sweat formed at the base of Olivia's neck. She hesitated, her palms damp. I didn't," she finally admitted. Silence. The weight of her admission settled over the room like a crushing force. Another executive, a middle-aged man with glasses, leaned forward. "Miss Hayes, the airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Your actions not only violated that policy but also jeopardized our reputation. Do you understand the severity of this situation?" Olivia swallowed hard. Her heart sank. "I do," she murmured. The panel exchanged glances before continuing. The questioning wasn't over. And Olivia knew. This was only the beginning of her reckoning. The executives remained professional, but their tone was unyielding. By the time the hearing ended, Olivia felt utterly drained. The final decision would be communicated to her in writing, but deep down, she already knew the outcome. Her career with the airline was over. As she stepped out of the room, a hollow emptiness settled over her. For the first time, she truly thought about Amelia, not just as a passenger but as a person. A woman who had maintained her dignity even as Olivia had tried to strip it away. And now, Olivia felt the full weight of her actions. Not just the impact on her career, but the harm she had caused to someone else. She had made a choice. And now, she was living with the consequences. Later that afternoon, Amelia sat in her office, a cup of tea resting in her hand as she reviewed an email from the airline's board. The message was clear. They were eager to demonstrate their commitment to reform. Attached was a detailed timeline of the policy changes she had demanded, mandatory training programs, a complete revision of the complaint handling process. It was a small but significant victory. Amelia allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Then her phone buzzed. A message from Maya. "Olivia Hayes has been officially terminated. Thought you'd want to know." Amelia set her cup down slowly, staring at the message. It didn't bring her joy, nor did it feel like true resolution. She wasn't the type to seek revenge. And she knew Olivia's dismissal was only a symptom of a larger issue. Yet it was a necessary step. An acknowledgement that actions had consequences. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. Her decision to act had been about more than just herself. It had been about setting a precedent. Not just for the airline, but for anyone who might one day find themselves in her position. She picked up her phone and typed a quick reply. "Thanks for letting me know. Let's keep focusing on the bigger picture." That evening, Olivia sat in her small apartment. The termination notice from the airline rested on the table in front of her. She had spent years building her career. And in a single day, it had all come crashing down. Olivia had spent hours replaying the hearing in her mind, searching for some justification for her actions. But there was none. The reality was stark and unavoidable. Her assumptions, rooted in prejudice, had cost her everything. Her phone buzzed intermittently with messages from friends and family. Some were filled with sympathy. Others with judgment. She couldn't bring herself to respond. She felt isolated, trapped by the weight of her mistakes. For years she had prided herself on being a competent professional, someone who followed the rules and did her job well. But now all of that seemed meaningless. She reached for the remote and turned on the television, desperate for some distraction. But the moment the screen flickered to life, she froze. A news segment about bias in the workplace was airing. It was as though the universe refused to let her escape her own actions. The segment featured a brief interview with Amelia Reed. She spoke eloquently, her words measured and powerful as she addressed the importance of systemic change and holding organizations accountable. Olivia stared at the screen, her chest tightening. Amelia's composure, her confidence, her unwavering sense of purpose. It stood in stark contrast to the turmoil Olivia was drowning in. And for the first time, Olivia saw Amelia not as an adversary, but as someone who had every right to demand better. Not just for herself, but for everyone. She switched off the television and sat in silence. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done. But maybe, just maybe, she could learn from it. Taking a deep breath, she reached for her laptop and began to type. The email was addressed to the airline's board. But it wasn't about defending herself. It was an apology. A sincere, unfiltered acknowledgement of her mistakes. Not just to Amelia, but to everyone her actions had affected. For the first time in days, Olivia felt a sliver of clarity. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how she moved forward. The following week, Amelia sat at her desk when a new email notification appeared on her screen. It had been forwarded by the airline's board. Subject: Apology from former staff. Curious, she clicked it open and began to read. The message was from Olivia Hayes, and it began with a simple acknowledgement of the truth. Miss Reed, I owe you an apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable. I acted on assumptions rather than facts, and I failed to see you for who you are. A valued passenger, and more importantly, a person who deserved respect. My behavior reflected poorly not only on me but on the airline as a whole. For that, I am truly sorry. Amelia read the email carefully, her eyes scanning each line with quiet contemplation. Miranda went on to explain how the aftermath of the incident had forced her to reflect deeply on her actions and their consequences. She admitted to her biases. She acknowledged the harm she had caused. And she expressed a genuine commitment to educating herself and becoming a better person. This experience has been humbling, Miranda wrote. And I've come to understand that the changes you are advocating for are desperately needed, not just in this airline but everywhere. I hope my actions, though wrong, can serve as an example of what must change. I am committed to learning and to never repeating such a mistake. Thank you for holding me accountable. Amelia leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't naive. She knew that people often apologize to ease their guilt, or to salvage their reputation. But something about Miranda's words felt different, genuine. And Amelia couldn't ignore that. She hesitated for a moment before drafting a brief response. Thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step toward growth. I hope you continue on this path and use this experience to create positive change in the future. She hit send. Closing her laptop, Amelia gazed out the window, lost in thought. For her, the incident had never been about personal justice. It was about creating a ripple effect, a movement toward something bigger. Miranda's apology didn't erase what had happened, but it hinted at the possibility of change. A small step, but Amelia knew. Even small steps could lead to something greater. Weeks passed. The ripple effects of Flight 287 were beginning to take hold. The airline had officially rolled out its first series of mandatory sensitivity and bias training sessions for all staff. The initiative was publicly announced, accompanied by a statement of accountability. Amelia's role in pushing for these changes was acknowledged, not as an antagonist, but as a catalyst for progress. The announcement sparked conversations across the industry, and the impact was only just beginning. The aviation industry was taking notice. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies. Some even reached out to Amelia directly, seeking guidance on implementing similar reforms. She declined most offers. Her focus remained on ensuring that the changes within her airline were fully realized. This was never about personal recognition. It was about creating lasting impact. One afternoon, Amelia found herself back at the airport, preparing to board a flight for a business meeting. As she approached the gate, she noticed something different. A subtle but undeniable shift in the way the staff interacted with passengers. Smiles were genuine. Questions were answered with patience and care. It wasn't perfect, no system ever was. but it was better. And that was a start. When Amelia reached the gate, the agent recognized her immediately. "Miss Reed, welcome back," they said warmly. "We've upgraded your seat as a token of our appreciation for your continued support." Amelia smiled, appreciating the gesture, but waved it off politely. "That's kind of you, but I'm fine where I am," she replied. As always, her confidence and humility blended seamlessly, drawing respect without demanding it. On board, Amelia took her seat. She observed the subtle changes in the way the crew carried themselves. They seemed more attentive, more engaged. Across the aisle, a young woman struggled to find space for her bag in the overhead compartment. Almost instinctively, a flight attendant stepped in to help. Their tone was warm, reassuring. It reminded Amelia of Claire, the one attendant who had shown her kindness when no one else had. She had made sure Claire's professionalism was recognized. And now, Claire had been promoted to a senior role. From her seat, Amelia spotted her near the front of the cabin, supervising the boarding process with steady confidence. Their eyes met. Claire smiled. A look of quiet gratitude passed between them. Amelia nodded back. An unspoken acknowledgement. A moment of shared respect. These were the moments that reminded Amelia why she had fought for change. Small gestures, multiplied over time, could transform an entire culture. As the plane took off, Amelia leaned back in her seat. The journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, she knew they were headed in the right direction. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Amelia reflected on the journey she had taken. Not just this flight, but everything that had followed. She thought about Olivia's apology. The systemic reforms now taking shape. The messages of support from strangers who had heard her story. It was humbling and empowering. All at once. Elsewhere in the city, Olivia was beginning a journey of her own. She had taken a job with a nonprofit organization dedicated to workplace diversity and inclusion. She used her own experience as a case study, an example of why change was necessary. The path wasn't easy, and she knew she had much to prove. But for the first time in her life, she was looking beyond herself, determined to contribute to something larger. Back on the plane, Amelia pulled out her notebook. Flipping to a blank page, she wrote a single line. "Change begins with accountability, but it thrives on persistence." She closed the notebook and leaned back, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. Through the window, the sky stretched endlessly before her. She knew the fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to do. But in that moment, as she gazed at the horizon, she felt something unexpected. Hope. The events of that flight had been painful, but they had ignited something much bigger than her. And with quiet certainty, Amelia knew. The sky was not the limit. It was just the beginning.